Okay, so formal introductions. I am Sherilyn Milsom. I have been investing in real estate since 2006 and in rent-to-own since 2009. And I've been helping colleagues and clients with rent-to-own for many, many years, since almost the beginning. And we had the question on our Facebook Live last week about what happens when you have to evict, what happens when a rent-to-own goes wrong. Well, rent-to-own is a fantastic way to sell a property and make a ton more money doing it. And when it all goes according to plan, everyone wins. But what do you do when it goes wrong? Preventing problems by setting up a solid deal is really the key to get started with rent-to-own and to avoid these glitches. So it starts with excellent tenant screening, and it has to go above and beyond what a normal tenant screening for a regular rental would be. So, for instance, we require notice of assessment and job letters and all sorts of other things that you don't really need for a regular rental. And the qualification has to be similar to a bank's qualification. Now, of course, we have a whole lot more flexibility in rent-to-own, but the person is eventually going to need to get to a mortgage through a bank. So we have to keep the bank's qualifiers in mind. Otherwise, we're setting the person up for failure and potentially eviction. And contracts are the key to prevent issues. If you have solidly worded, concise, clear, unambiguous contracts that everyone understands, then you have a much better chance of a successful rent-to-own without any court issues or fighting or anything like that. Extra documentation can mean extra protection. One thing that I use is I have an option disclosure statement. I'm not sure how much of it you can see here, but it covers basically everything that we talk about when we're explaining rent-to-own to people, everything, all of their risks, all of their responsibilities, how to improve their credit. Everything relevant to this deal is put in this document, and they sign it. And that eliminates a lot of frustration and questions and potential problems later, because it's all spelled out. And nobody can say, hey, I didn't know about that. Well, actually, you do, because you signed that you do. So extra documentation equals extra protection. And larger option payments really mitigate risk. If the tenant so the option payment is the money that comes up front that gets to put towards the down payment when the tenant buys the house. And the more money, the better. The tenant then has more skin in the game. They're more mentally and financially committed to this property. So they want to make sure that they follow through with everything that they're supposed to do and follow it right through to a successful conclusion. If somebody's only got $5,000 in the deal, they're going to be way less committed, and it's way easier to walk away from $5,000 than it is from $30,000, for example. And a larger option payment also provides a cushion against financial issues. So for instance, if a tenant does have a little glitch where, maybe they get sick and they're off work for a while or whatever the case may be, if they've got a much larger option payment in play, then I personally am going to be much more willing to accommodate and to work with them, because again, I want them to buy the house, and when they have a bigger option payment, then I feel I have more security, and so I can be more flexible. So a larger option payment is extremely important for me. Now, when things do go wrong, let's put if, because it's extremely rare, but larger option payments mitigate, oh my goodness, I went backwards, sorry about that. There's an important distinction. Tenancy can go to a tenancy tribunal. In Alberta, we have something called the Residential Tenancies Dispute Resolution Service, or RTDRS. And I know that other locations have similar tenancy tribunals under various names. So if it's strictly a tenancy issue, it can go to the tenancy tribunal or it can go to court. If it's a property matter, it always goes to court. So in Canada, that would be the Court of Queen's Bench. Anything to do with an interest in property or a suspected interest in property goes to the Court of Queen's Bench. So, and it's also important, property matters are much more complicated to resolve, even if the interest isn't real, even if the person only, maybe their interest has expired or something like that, or it's void, it still has to be proven that way. So it's still more complicated and costly to resolve. So at the first sign of trouble with a tenant in arrears, what I would do is talk with them, find out what the issue is, what their prospects are, what challenges they're having. Because remember, this isn't just a regular tenant who's going to do a midnight move on you. They've got thousands of dollars invested with you as the future down payment on their home. So they've got something to lose. They're not going to just bolt, generally speaking. Remember that a strong option contract will have a clause stating that if the lease has been breached, including for arrears, the option will be void. So it is technically possible that as soon as somebody is late with their rent, we could turn around and give them a notice that the option is void. And that actually might be good practice to say, okay, you're late, your option is void. As soon as you get paid up, then we can talk about starting a new option with you. So that is one way that some people might handle it in order to prevent further issues and to really set the expectation that no, it's not okay. But again, I would first talk to the tenant, find out what the issue is. Maybe it's just something that that doesn't require something more, militant, like sending out a notice of void. And again, higher option payments mean more patience for me. If somebody has a $5,000 option payment, I'm going to be on them a little quicker than if they've got a $50,000 option payment, because I've got such a big cushion that we can wait, and if they've got a job slowdown, for instance, where they're choosing between paying down their credit and paying me, I want them to buy the house, so I don't want them to be late on their payments, because then they're not going to be able to buy the house. So it really depends on the exact situation, how you handle it. But again, higher option payments for me means more patience. Now, once the arrears total a certain amount of the option payment, then you really have to act. You must do something, whether it's as simple as sending out the void letter and then having a more serious chat, or whether it's looking at eviction proceedings. We're going to discuss all of those. Remember that we want the tenant to buy the property, but is there hope that they can? That's the real question. Now, I have a few scenarios and solutions for you, but if you have any questions, I just want to remind you to type them into the comment box, and I'll be checking periodically to answer them, and make sure that everybody's questions get answered. And if you're watching this as a replay, please still type your questions in, because I will be checking back and answering questions after the fact. Now, for people who are just joining in, what we were just talking about was how prevention is the key for avoiding all of these problems. So having proper tenant screening, really excellent qualifications, similar to how a bank would qualify a tenant, and also solid, clear, concise contracts. Those are the real critical points to avoiding the following situations, which we're going to get into now. Okay, and excellent. No questions yet, but again, keep posting them and we will make sure they get answered. So scenario number one is that the person has no hope right now. They're in arrears, things look bad, but they have potential for the future. And there are a couple different ways we can handle that. One thing I did was have the tenants waive their interest in the property, but because they were confident they were going to get back on their feet, they were confident they were going to get caught up again, we didn't, and we still wanted them to buy the house, they still wanted to buy the house. So what we did in that situation was we had them waive their interest in the property, so to officially declare the option void, so that we wouldn't ever have to worry about going to court if they never did get back on their feet. We could handle it in the tenancy tribunal without the whole property matter in there. So in that case, the tenant becomes a regular tenant instead of a tenant buyer. They agreed that their option payments were forfeit as per the option agreement, and they were still responsible for the arrears. Now, of course, once they got back on their feet, then they would have the right to repurchase the option, and those forfeited option payments would get put back in place as their option payment. So, and that's what we all thought would happen. So that's how we handled that. And if that doesn't work out, as I mentioned, then it's a lot easier to get them evicted, to get your order of possession, because there is no interest in land involved. Now, when I say about the sign-out release, I have 3 actually different types of release, waiver and release of interest in the property. So I've used all 3 of these because we've been doing this a long time. So yeah, we have had a few people had to walk away. So the first one is a waiver of interest when they know they're done, they can't do this, they don't expect any money back because they have some arrears and whatever, and they know about the liquidated damages, and they don't expect anything back, so they're just walking away. So that's the waiver for this one, for that situation. Then we have another waiver where the people have a substantial option payment, and in this one case, they had a substantial option payment built up. It was about 15 or 16% of the purchase price, so a lot of money involved. And they were walking away because they just couldn't get their act together. And after several renewals, it was clear they were never going to be able to buy the property. So we basically gave them a final deadline and said, if you don't buy this property by this date, then this is what's going to happen. Now, because they had a substantial payment in there, we wanted to give them something back. Unfortunately, the market had changed a bit, and so our costs were going to be quite large. So we did keep a huge chunk forfeit as liquidated damages as per our contract, but we did give them some back. So this is a waiver and release upon final payment. So it outlines, yes, we are going to refund you this much money, and you in turn agree to waive all your interest in the property and rights to the property. And the final one is the one we used where we let the tenant live in the property, hoping that they would be able to buy back the option. So this one is much more complicated because it outlines, we understand that if there does become an eviction required, it's going to be no contest and a whole lot of extra details. So yeah, but the important thing is, if you get a release or waiver of interest in the property, then it's much easier to handle in a tenancy tribunal or in provincial court or Court of Queen's Bench, I should say. It's much easier to handle in court when there's officially already signed off no interest in the property. Okay. Now, let's check to see if we have any questions. No. All right, scenario number 2 is that there is no hope in the foreseeable future. And so I tell those people a few things. Your option payments will be kept as liquidated damages to cover our costs to refresh the property and market it to somebody else. And if you keep the place in show home condition, neat, tidy, absolutely gorgeous, it will sell faster and for more money. That means we may have some money we can return to you. Because my thoughts are, I don't want the same money, I don't want money from 2 different people for the same thing, for the same house. So if I'm able to sell the property at basically the same price that I was supposed to sell it to them, and my costs are only, let's say, $5,000, so I'm only out $5,000, why would I keep a $20,000 option payment? Because I'm still going to get paid all the money on the other person. So that just doesn't seem right to me. Now, I'm not obligated to refund any money, but I choose to. If there's anything above my costs, then I'm going to refund that money, and that's their reward. Also, their incentive to have it absolutely gorgeous all the time, make it easy for me to find a replacement, and hopefully they get some money in return. All right. The third scenario is that if the tenant is uncooperative, then you're going to have to go through an eviction. And except it's not really an eviction, because you're not going to write them a 14-day eviction notice. If you've got a tenant who's paid you $20,000 for the right to buy a property, they're not going to leave based on a 14-day eviction notice. So you must go through the court procedure through either the tenancy tribunal or through Court of Queen's Bench, or whatever the case may be in your area. So you file a court for arrears and for an order of possession. And often, surprisingly, the tenant will not show up. If that's the case, then this is where having really solid contracts are so important, because the lease should never mention the option. The lease should be strictly about the tenancy. The option agreement is completely separate. So, and the option agreement is not going to be part of your application to have the tenant removed. So if the tenant does not show up at the hearing, then there's no mention of the option, and it just proceeds as a straight tenancy eviction application, and it should be relatively simple. Now, if the tenant does appear at the hearing, he will be sure to mention that he has option payments in play and that he has a purchaser's interest in the property. Now, if you are at a tenancy tribunal at this point, of course it will get kicked up to the higher court. And in court, you must have an option contract that makes it clear that the option is void in the case of a breach of the lease. So that's your first step, that you can show that the lease has been breached. That means the option is void. That voids the tenant's interest in the property. They have no more interest in the property. So you have to have strongly worded option agreements. And also, your option agreement should say that the option payments are kept as liquidated damages and not as penalty. Now, liquidated damages, that's to cover the costs that you're incurring from the tenant breaching his agreement. So if the judge deems that it's a penalty of any kind, then he's not going to allow you to keep them. So you may need to justify why you should be entitled to these liquidated damages. So be prepared with explanations and maybe even estimated numbers for what it's going to take to refresh the property for sale, the marketing expenses to find a new tenant buyer, possibly realtor fees if you are going to also pursue the regular sale route, and the vacancy that you're going to incur. Now keep in mind that this is not a house for regular tenancy, which is usually relatively easy to fill with little vacancy and little marketing costs. When you're dealing with a home that you're trying to sell for rent to own, and you're going to do that again, there's going to be a bit more marketing costs. There's going to be more time, because the market is so much smaller for tenant buyers as opposed to just regular tenants. So you'll want to get that across to the judge. That should justify why you should have the liquidated damages for vacancy and realtor's fees and all of that. Also, you may need to discount the price to be less than what the current tenant had agreed on. So that in itself is liquidated damages, because you have lost revenue because he breached that agreement, and now you're going to end up with this price. And it comes down to, without having solid contracts with terms such as these, it is very possible the judge could order that your option payments get put towards the arrears. If you can't justify between the terms of your contract and the fact that you should have these liquidated damages, then you could end up losing that money. Now, the tenant may try to fight to stay and may even argue that he has an ownership interest in the property. Well, again, that's very important to establish that he does not have an ownership interest in the property. That's one of the things my option disclosures covers, that he's a tenant with a right to buy. He has no ownership interest. Now, the option agreement does give him a purchaser's interest in the property, which can be registered on title, but if your contracts are worded properly, it should be clear that once he breached the lease, that option was void, which nullifies his purchaser's interest in the property. Now, in my experience, I've only had one rent-to-own go really, really wrong. And that was a case where the tenant buyer, the reason he couldn't qualify for a mortgage on his own is because he was still on the matrimonial mortgage with him and his soon-to-be ex-wife. He was in the middle of a divorce. Now, when it came time to buy, he couldn't because the wife realized, I can't keep this house if you're off the mortgage. So she was causing all kinds of trouble for, well, I can't say causing all kinds of trouble, but she didn't allow the house to be sold. That's what I know. And so because he was still on that house then, he still couldn't buy ours. And as per our agreements, the price of the house was raised for the renewal. And I think that just sent him over the edge. I quickly realized that he was the type of person who, when life hands him lemons, he's going to make sure everyone else around him has more lemons than he does. So that became quite an experience. When I realized that he was going to be problematic, I sent him a registered letter offering his option payment back, all but I think $2,000 for me to list it on the MLS. And it was then totally clear that he had kind of gone off the deep end because he refused the money and decided to sue me instead for all kinds of ridiculous made-up things, just because he wanted to make sure that if he was miserable, other people were miserable too. So, and I've actually heard that from other people as well, so it's not just me. But anyway, the bottom line is it all turned out fine because, of course, there was nothing he could do because our contracts are solid and well spelled out, and we've got it all laid out that yes, the price will go up. So because everything was set up so well, there was nothing he could do, and it all ended up fine. But again, it was an annoying, costly experience. But those are so rare. The horror stories in rent-to-own are extremely rare. And if you properly screen and qualify and have rock-solid contracts and set up your rent-to-own for success, then you should never come across somebody like that. I think that was kind of a 1 in a million. Remember, I've had extremely high success rates for closing to tenants for both myself and my colleagues and clients that I've helped. But again, it comes to transparency and complete understanding and unambiguous contracts. If it's all spelled out, everybody knows what their rights, their obligations, the risks are, then that's what really sets up a successful rent-to-own. Now, it's impossible. I did also want to say that if you set up your rent-to-own for success like that, then you can potentially make a ton more money selling your house. On average, I think it's about $60,000 for the people that I've helped for each one for, say a 2 to 3 year rent-to-own as opposed to a realtor. Now, it's impossible to cover all of the pros and cons and ins and outs of rent-to-own in this tiny short little video. So if you are interested in more information on rent-to-own and real estate in general, including how to set up a successful rent-to-own for yourself and operate it to a successful conclusion, I do have a course coming out soon. And if you click the link below, you'll be able to sign up for some free information about rent-to-own and real estate in general. and then we'll put you on our mailing list so that you can receive more information about all of those things, plus information about our course as it becomes available. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon.